This week on Quality Digest Live, we're going to talk about apprenticeship programs and what the Biden administration might be able to do to build them up. Join us in a few seconds. Welcome back to QDL. QDL is your weekly look at who and what is making news in the world of quality. I'm Dirk Ducharme, Editor-in-Chief of Quality Digest. Job losses caused by the pandemic continue to affect millions. We know this, and especially for those employed in certain industries like retail and hospitality. Those two sectors in particular were practically shut down during the COVID-19 pandemic. So one solution for getting people back to work is apprenticeship programs. Whether a person wants to increase their skills in the industry they are in, or maybe learn a new trade because maybe the one they're in isn't all that secure, apprenticeships could be an answer. So funding new apprenticeship programs now provides jobs now, but also generates high long-term gains in skills, productivity, and earnings for particularly younger workers, and actually has benefits for the companies as well. So joining us once again to talk about apprenticeships is Nicholas Wyman, CEO of the Institute for Workplace Skills and Innovation, IWSI America. Nick, thanks for coming back on the show again.
Delighted to be here.
So tell us a little bit, for those who didn't see the last time you were on, what does IWSI do?
So IWSI America is primarily, we're a workforce development company. It's a 501c3, and we help companies and governments rethink and reimagine how they might transition people from school to work, transition existing workers. And of course, what we're going to talk about today, near and dear to my heart, is apprenticeship.
And how does IWSI aid in that?
Sure. I think, apprenticeship it's actually the Western world's oldest form of occupational learning. But in the US, things have been slow to catch on. In my homeland, which isn't Paducah County in Kentucky, it's actually Australia. So for those listeners out there who are thinking there's something going on with something going on with my program, but it's my country has got 500,000 apprentices for 20. Well, I should say my homeland has got 20 million people and 500,000 apprentices. And up until recently, the US had the same number of apprentices, 500,000 apprentices, clearly on a much, much larger population. So opportunity to expand. Apprenticeships were very much in building and construction, and really weren't considered in other occupations, hospitality, tourism you mentioned, but also in manufacturing, advanced manufacturing, healthcare, IT. And so our organisation is able to take our experience from programs that we've set up in the Asia Pacific region. In Australia, I've personally graduated, it's the Royal Eye. My organisation has graduated 20,000 people through apprenticeship programs. So we're able to take that experience, work we've undertaken in Singapore, work we've undertaken in the UK, and work with US companies and say, well, this is what's going on in other parts of the world. What's a model that's going to work here in the US? And that's really key to what I'm going to talk about today, that it's not one size fits all. What works in California might not work in Kentucky. What works in another corner of the country might not work in your particular region or for your particular company. But the fundamentals of learning and earning is what we're here to talk about.
Yeah, so let's talk about that a little bit. You wrote an article for us recently, 4 things President Biden can do to expand apprenticeships. And one of the things you talked about was for the U.S. government to subsidize apprenticeship programs, because that's, as you mentioned, that's something that's currently being done in Australia. Now, I do know that the United States government does have some apprenticeship programs. In fact, I think there's a website, apprenticeship.gov.
Yeah.
Does that not go far enough? Is that not doing quite what Australia and the UK are currently doing?
Well, I think, if you look at the maturity of the systems, and if you look to the UK, or you look to Switzerland, where apprenticeship's been running a lot longer, it is actually easier for companies to access the system and start an apprenticeship program. And the idea of a subsidy, when we're talking about in the Australian context, this is by no means the reason that employers should consider taking on an apprentice or starting an apprenticeship program. We're not talking about a fully subsidised position, because the problem with that, if it's a wages or wages only subsidy, when the funding stops, quite often the positions stop and we're back where we started. But the sort of subsidies I'm talking about are modest. They're a percentage of the person's wage. It would be based on performance of the company as much as the performance of the individual. You don't receive the incentive on day one. There's milestone payments. So in Australia, how it works is you receive about $1,500 assistance when the apprentice commences. And that's to help you with things like setting up a learning program and out-of-pocket expenses that your company may need to incur to take that apprentice on. There's also a completion payment. So when the apprentice completes at the end of the duration of the program, in Australia, there's around $2,500 per apprentice. So $4,000 is certainly not the reason that a company should want to engage with apprenticeship, but from the experience, and I've been fortunate enough to work with a public policy institute called the Urban Institute in Washington, DC, where we've been actually piloting assistance to employers, and a little bit of financial assistance goes a long way. As you said at the top of the show, not only individuals are doing it hard, there's a lot of companies in all sectors. I don't think anybody hasn't been impacted by the last 12 months. But with that, the devastation that the pandemic has caused, it's also an opportunity for individuals to think about the careers and the industry they'd like to be working in, and an opportunity for companies to think about how they might bring people into their organisation. So I'm saying, as you rebuild your organisation or you reconsider your career, stand back and say, what are the different ways? Traditional pathways would be go to an educational facility and undertake a qualification and then come out and find a job. I'm talking about an opportunity where you actually get paid to learn. So it's an on and off the job learning experience.
Well, there's another thing, aspect, something that they're doing in Australia, which is, it all ties together, but I thought this was interesting, is a program, and correct me if I'm wrong here, that encourages companies to convert their part-time workers into apprenticeships. A kind of a means, I guess, of transitioning a part-time worker to a full-time skilled worker via an apprenticeship program. Do I have that right?
You've hit the nail on the head. The idea is developing a person's skills and their skill level. In parallel to the pandemic, of course, globalization and technological change certainly hasn't halted. In fact, in a lot of industries, it's actually sped up. We're now talking on a medium that wasn't used as much before the pandemic. There was a lot more face-to-face interaction. So I think that it's really important that companies look at how to not only attract people into their companies, but how to retain them. And what I like about an apprenticeship program is there is a structure. There is actually for somebody undertaking an apprenticeship, you actually sit down with them and you map out what the next couple of years is going to look like and the learning that they're going to need to undertake. So every apprentice in our programs that we design would receive an individual learning plan, and it really is developing the skills of that individual. And that is going to lead to retention. If the work is interesting and people can see a career progression ladder. I was talking to some folks in the automotive industry, and parts of their business are very routine and very mechanized. And there's an opportunity for people in entry-level roles in the automotive industry to actually progress. And one of the best ways to do that is through an apprenticeship. It's a win-win. The individual is developing their skills and taking on more skills, which is helping their learning. But for the organisation, it's going to retain people, and it's also going to give people an interest and really buy them into the culture of your organisation. So that to me is a huge opportunity at the moment for employers. I wrote an article actually some months back, and it's, where to find your next great hire. And so you don't have to read the article, or the listeners don't have to read, or the people listening don't have to go and find the article. The message was, look within. There's some great people in your organisation. How can you develop that talent? How can you put people into a quality, well thought out program?
As you were talking, something dawned on me. I know President Biden just strengthened the Buy America Act, which basically, for those of you who aren't familiar, if you're a government contractor, you are familiar with this, where the government has to buy from American vendors, and there's certain criteria of what an American vendor is, a U.S. vendor is, and they've recently, under the Biden administration, looking at tightening what that is, tightening up what those restrictions are, which some people say could actually exacerbate the skills gap problem. Would you agree with that?
Look, I think that whenever there is a policy change at a federal or a state level, there are always ripple effects, and sometimes they're tidal waves that flow back through organisations and their potential talent pool. And at the moment, it's actually, I'm finding a lot of companies overwhelmed trying to navigate their way through their workforce needs. Some people are overrun with more applicants than they've ever had before, which is posing problems. How do you find the people that are right for your company or right for your industry? But there's no question the shape and the way we work, the way we live, and goodness only knows the way we learn. I have a 16-year-old at home who's learnt from her iOS device for the last 12 months. And I look forward to getting her back into a classroom. But why I raise that is that we could have a whole generation of young people who have been working in isolation, working at the end of a screen. There's all sorts of implications post this pandemic that we haven't even considered yet. Could we end up with a lost generation of young people? They weren't given the opportunity. The people who finished high school or graduated high school in 2020, and sadly the way things are shaping up here already, it could be the graduates of 2021. We have tens of thousands of young people who failed to make that school to work transition. So there lies an opportunity for employers. I think that, when government, and to answer your question, I kind of skated around the edge of that one a little bit.
I noticed that.
It's like, listen, Nick, just give me a straight answer on this one. Is it best, is compulsion the way to go, to tell companies what to do? I'm not necessarily sure if that's the best way to go. I know that government, brings in policies, well-intended policies. It actually makes sense. It makes sense to quite often employ people from your local community. That's one thing I have seen. Hiring practices are most definitely changing. Pre-pandemic, the large corporations had these central recruiting and resourcing hubs, and they've now delegated that out to regional, and they're getting the hiring decisions back into the communities in which the companies are operating, and that makes sense to me.
When it comes to, anytime you talk about the government funding some sort of program,
yes,
a certain sector of the populace is going to go, what, another, we're going to make the government pay for something else. And in this case, might they have an argument if industry is lacking skilled workers, should the government be responsible for funding apprenticeship programs? Because obviously any kind of government funding is going to come with government strings. That's always the case. Or should industry be responsible? I mean, how much How much government really play a part in subsidizing or, in somehow supporting industry in terms of apprenticeship programs?
That's a tough one. No, it's actually, to me, it really comes down to the question, whose problem is this? Ultimately, this is an industry problem. They're the organisations that need skilled people to run their businesses, to run your business, to run your company. I believe the government does have a role to play. The government needs to create an environment for employers to want to employ, to be able to take on young people. There is no question that navigating your way into an apprenticeship for a company, for an individual, has certainly not been streamlined. There's a lot of processes, there's a lot of red tape, there's a lot of reasons that when a company navigates their way through, they're exhausted and not able to take on a person, or they just simply give up. I'm talking about creating a whole new generation of taxpayers here. This makes sense. This is not training people for training's sake, or training people who end up with a wall full of certificates but no job.
Right.
We're not creating a generation of people who are shackled with student debt. This is simply a structured way for people to earn and learn, enter the workforce. And what I'm proposing or suggesting here is the government makes a modest investment and says those companies that want to take on someone for the right reasons, that they have a skills need and they want to compete and they want to use human capital as an area to create competitive advantage, why not give them a bit of a hand up? It really, one of the things even in Australia is that the community college system is fully subsidised by the government in most states and territories in Australia. In the US, that's not the case. So if you do take on the apprentice, you do have to cover the cost of training. And these are all additional costs that you've got to factor into taking on this entry-level person.
Right.
That can sometimes be a barrier for a company, because they say, well, why would I want to, why would I want to employ someone who doesn't have a lot of skills and develop them in training, and then the person down the street's going to take that employee and offer them an extra $1 or 50 cents or $1 an hour. And what we're saying here is that I think it makes good economic sense. We want to engage this generation. We've got an aging population. The last thing that any state or the United States needs is a generation of young people who are sitting on the sidelines, not engaged, not employed, not contributing to their communities, and not paying taxes. I think it's a win-win situation.
All right. Well, Nicholas Wyman, CEO of IWSI America, thanks for joining us. And I'm sure I'm going to include a link out to IWSI America underneath the player page down there. I'm assuming there's resources out there, information that people can glean from your website as well, right?
Look, absolutely. There is a free resource on the site. We wrote a publication for employers, specifically, for manufacturing and IT and some tech industries, called It's Time. Nothing like a bit of a plug of my own resource, but it is an absolute no cost. You can download it for free. You don't need to leave your details. And it really explains to a company if they're interested. So it's called It's Time, Using Modern Apprenticeship to Reskill America. It's not written in an academic way at all. It's written for an organisation to say, what are some of the myths, some of the misconceptions? And if I wanted to start an apprenticeship, how might I do that? Would I do it directly? One fantastic thing that we're seeing across the US is some intermediary organisations starting to pop up, which will help companies either set up their programs or be able to help companies engage. It also covers off some of the obvious questions. What's the difference between an apprenticeship, internship? We don't have time to talk about that now, but what I'd say to the listeners, if they wanted to learn more or have a deep dive, definitely that's one great publication. You mentioned some of the government's websites are really good. There are other resources. Some of them are a little bit complicated. So I think that's a couple of great places to start. And I'm also on Twitter, Nicholas_Wyman, if someone wanted to send a tweet or to tag us or get us both involved in the conversation. Right. I'm sure we could both point people in the right direction wherever they're located in the country.
And I'll have all those links, the links to the websites and your Twitter account, so forth. Again, they're underneath the player page down there. People can see them. Nick, thanks a lot. Appreciate you coming on the show once again.
Always a pleasure, and thanks again for having me on. And I really hope that people listening here are saying, this apprenticeship thing, look, check it out. It's a real opportunity for companies at the moment to get some advantage in these rapidly changing times. Thanks again.
Exactly. No problem. And that is it for today's Quality Digest Live. Thanks to all of you for joining us. And as usual, if you have any ideas, some people you'd like us to bring on the show or some topic you'd like us to discuss, just send your ideas to qdl@qualitydigest.com and we will do our best. Thanks again for joining us, and we will see you at the next QDL. So long.